What terrible truth could make a man lie just to drive the only woman he had ever loved out of his life? Years later, she came back, still pretending you can't hear people when you don't like what they're saying. Caleb Redhawk went still. Around him, the livery carried on. A horse stamped inside its stall. Leather creaked. Someone laughed out on the street. Caleb heard none of it. His hand tightened once around the saddle horn beneath his palm, then loosened. He knew that voice. Years had passed since he had heard it anywhere but in memory. He turned. Ellie Whitmore stood a few yards away. Time had changed her. Of course it had. But Caleb noticed the things it had left alone before he could stop himself. The slight lift of her chin when she expected an argument. The way she looked straight at him instead of around him. The faint pull at one corner of her mouth when she was nervous and determined not to show it. He hated that he remembered. Ellie held his gaze. So you did hear me. Hard not to. That's new. Something almost happened to his mouth. Almost. Let me take that. Ellie. A man stepped through the livery doorway behind her. Jonathan Hale. He reached for the traveling bag beside Ellie, with the easy familiarity of someone who had done it before. Caleb knew enough about him. Educated, respectable, steady. The kind of man who looked comfortable in a clean coat and probably had never wondered which bill could wait until next month. Hale lifted the bag. I can take this out to the ranch. That won't be necessary. The words came from Caleb. John looked at him. So did Ellie. I don't mind, John said. I know. Caleb took the bag from his hand. Ellie's eyes dropped briefly to Caleb's grip on the handle, then rose to his face. She said nothing. That was worse. Caleb looked at her. How long are you staying? Until the school finds another teacher. How long is that? Haven't decided. He disliked the answer immediately. Ellie had come back because the local schoolhouse needed temporary help, not because of him. That should have made things simpler. It didn't. By late afternoon, they were riding toward the ranch with her luggage in the wagon behind them. Neither mentioned that John had originally offered to bring her. When the house came into view, Ellie slowed her horse. Caleb noticed that too. The place was different now. The old roof had been replaced years ago. A larger porch ran across the front. New barns stood beyond the corrals, and horses grazed behind strong fences where broken posts had once leaned into weeds. Caleb had spent years changing almost everything. Almost. He carried her bag onto the porch. There's a boarding house in town. Ellie turned. A boarding house. Clean rooms. How thoughtful. I can have someone take your things back. Why would I pay for a room? Because people generally pay for places they live. She looked at him, as if he had said something remarkably stupid. I already have a room. Caleb's jaw tightened. Of course she did. Ellie took the bag from him and went inside. The house was larger, brighter, better built. The kitchen had been expanded. The old floors were gone. The walls no longer let winter wind through their cracks. But the bones of the place were still there. Ellie crossed the entryway without waiting to be invited. She did not look around like a visitor. She simply went upstairs. At the third step, her foot shifted automatically. She stepped over it. Caleb stopped below. That board had creaked when they were children. It had been replaced years ago. She avoided it anyway. He followed her up. At the end of the hall, Ellie stopped in front of a door. For the first time since she had appeared in town, some of the certainty left her face. Her fingers rested on the knob. Then she opened it. A bed stood against one wall. A washstand sat near it. Beneath the window was the same small wooden desk that had been there years ago. The curtains were different. The walls had been painted. Nothing had been preserved carefully, but no one had lived there. No guest, no ranch hand, no trunks or old tack had been piled in the corners. Ellie walked inside. Her fingertips passed slowly over the edge of the desk. Then she turned. Why? Caleb leaned against the doorframe. Why what? The room needed somewhere to put dust. Ellie glanced at the spotless tabletop. There isn't any dust. Sounds like a housekeeping problem. For half a second, her mouth threatened to curve. Then it was gone. She looked around the room once more. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. You told me never to come back. Caleb said nothing. He had learned how to handle frightened horses and difficult men. He could recognize a bad deal before the other man finished offering it. He had built a ranch from almost nothing and learned that most problems became manageable once a man stopped being afraid to look directly at them. Ellie Whitmore had never been most problems. She waited. Caleb still had no answer. Years earlier, the first time Ellie Whitmore had walked into this house, he had wanted her gone just as his body. She had been 10. He had been 12. He couldn't stand her. And if anyone had told Caleb then that one day he would be the reason she left, he might have thought that sounded perfect. But Caleb had no idea that the girl he once wanted gone would become the one person he could never truly let go. And years later, the cruelest thing he would ever do would be convincing her that he had. If you want to see how two children who could barely stand each other became impossible to forget, subscribe to the Wild West Tales and stay with their story. The first thing Caleb disliked about Ellie Whitmore was that she arrived with too many bags. The second was that her mother called his house home. This will be our home now, Vivian told her daughter as Silas carried another trunk inside. Ellie stood beside the wagon, 10 years old and dusty from the road, looking at the house with none of the excitement her mother seemed to expect. She had heard some version of that promise before. There had already been 2 husbands before Silas. 2 houses Vivian had filled with plans for a better life. And 2 places Ellie had eventually been told to pack up and leave. By then, she had learned that adults could use the word home long before they knew whether they intended to stay. So Ellie said nothing. She simply picked up her smallest bag and followed her mother inside. Caleb watched from the porch. At 12, he was thin, sharp-eyed, and already very good at making people understand when they were not welcome. As far as he was concerned, Vivian had taken his father's attention, and now her daughter was taking up space in a house that had once belonged to his mother too. When Vivian showed Ellie the upstairs bedroom, Caleb appeared in the doorway. "This room is yours," Vivian said. "No, it isn't." Ellie turned toward him. "Is your name on it?" "It doesn't have to be." "Then I guess it isn't yours either." Caleb decided almost immediately that he disliked her. Ellie reached the same conclusion. The next morning, one of her shoes disappeared. She eventually found it in the woodpile and said nothing, which should have worried Caleb more than it did. Later that afternoon, he discovered a burr beneath his saddle blanket. He responded by hanging her favorite ribbon in the chicken coop. Ellie waited until the following morning and switched the sugar beside his oatmeal with salt. Caleb took one bite and slowly looked across the table. Ellie continued eating as though nothing had happened. Silas failed to notice the entire exchange. Vivian noticed and chose not to become involved. Caleb waited until he and Ellie were outside before saying, "You're not going to last here." She kept walking. "You hear me? I hear lots of unpleasant things. Winter'll send you running." That made her stop. She turned to face him with her hands on her hips. "I've survived worse things than you." Caleb considered this for a moment. "Give it time." Ellie walked away, convinced he was the most irritating boy she had ever met. Caleb watched her go with the satisfaction of someone who considered that an achievement. Over the next several weeks, however, Ellie began noticing things she had not intended to notice. Caleb always seemed to know what kind of evening was coming before anyone else did. Sometimes all it took was the sound of Silas's boots crossing the porch for something in him to change. On those evenings, Caleb often found a reason to stay near the barn until late. Other times, he sat through supper unusually quiet, watching his father without seeming to look at him. Ellie never asked why. She had lived in enough uncertain houses to recognize what it meant when a child learned to read an adult's mood before the adult had spoken. Then one morning, Caleb's chair at the breakfast table was empty. Vivian barely glanced at it, and Silas said nothing. Ellie finished her meal, wrapped a piece of bread and some leftover meat in a cloth, then slipped outside before anyone could ask where she was going. She found Caleb sitting behind the stable with his back against the wall. He looked up as her shadow crossed the ground. "What do you want?" "Nothing." "Then go away." Ellie held out the bundle. His expression changed immediately. "I don't need it." "Fine." She placed the food beside him and walked away. When she returned sometime later, the cloth was empty. Ellie saw it, and from the way Caleb avoided her eyes, she knew he had seen her notice. She did not mention it. Instead, she placed a tin cup of water beside him and sat several feet away, pulling pieces of dry grass from the hem of her skirt. She did not ask what had happened. She did not tell him she felt sorry for him. She did not wait for gratitude for a while. Neither of them spoke. Then Caleb reached for the water. Ellie turned her attention toward the horses while he drank. The next morning, she came downstairs and found one of her ribbons hanging from the antler above the front door. She stopped beneath it and looked across the room. Caleb continued eating his breakfast. "You put that there. Could have been anybody. You're the only person in this house awful enough to do it." He shrugged. Ellie pulled down the ribbon. "I thought yesterday might have made you less awful. You thought wrong." She marched outside and shut the door behind her. Caleb kept eating for a moment before his eyes drifted toward the door. He did not understand yet what the day before mattered. Ellie had brought him food, and when he rejected it, she had left. But then she had done something almost no one in Caleb's life ever did. She came back. And after that, Caleb began noticing whenever she didn't. By the second morning, Ellie had moved Caleb's coffee to the opposite side of the kitchen. He found it there before breakfast and stood looking at it for a moment. "Why?" Ellie glanced up from the stove. "Why what?" "My coffee. It was in the way. It's been there for 6 years. Then it's been in the way for 6 years." Caleb stared at her, but Ellie only lifted her cup to hide a smile. It did not take long for the rest of her to spread through the house. By the third morning, her boots stood beside his, at the back door. Her books occupied one end of the dining table, and she had informed him that any man who owned 300 acres could afford coffee that did not taste like boiled fence posts. By the fourth, Caleb had asked twice when she planned to leave. Ellie had answered neither time. He told himself her refusal irritated him. It probably should have irritated him more. That evening, Caleb came in long after sunset and found Ellie at the dining table marking school papers beneath the lamplight. She barely looked up when he entered, but when he passed the table on his way toward the kitchen, she asked, "Did you eat?" "Yeah." Ellie's pencil stopped. She looked at him. "You're lying." Caleb paused with one glove half removed. For a moment, neither of them said anything. He remembered a piece of bread wrapped in cloth behind a stable and a 10-year-old girl who had known better than to ask questions he would never have answered. Then he pulled off the other glove. I'm not 12 anymore. No. At 12 you were better at lying. A knock at the door saved him from answering. The door opened a moment later, and a woman stepped inside. She was, perhaps 30, dressed simply but well, with the quiet confidence of someone who had been welcome in the house often enough not to wait on the porch. Caleb. Rebecca Morrow smiled when she saw him. You missed supper again, didn't you? Ellie's pencil stopped for the second time that evening. Caleb looked between the two women. Apparently everyone in this town keeps records of my meals. Someone has to. Rebecca crossed toward the kitchen with an ease Ellie noticed immediately. She knew where Caleb kept the coffee and which cup he reached for. When she saw the pot Ellie had made, she laughed deeply. You made his coffee that strong. He drinks it that way. Ellie said. Not anymore. It was an ordinary answer. Ellie had no reason to dislike it. She disliked it anyway. Rebecca knew the man Caleb had become while Ellie had been away. She knew what time he came in from the ranch, where he kept his coffee, what he ate, and apparently how his tastes had changed. Ellie knew things Rebecca probably never would, but for the first time since coming home, she became sharply aware of all the years between leaving this house and walking back into it. Caleb introduced them properly. Rebecca was gracious, and Ellie was equally so. Caleb, who had spent enough years around horses to recognize when two creatures were quietly assessing one another, decided that staying near the coffee was the wisest place for him. Rebecca had been widowed several years earlier. A hard winter and debts left behind by her husband had nearly cost her everything, and Caleb had helped her through the worst of it. Since then, she had become familiar with the ranch, the people who worked there, and clearly the house itself. Then her attention moved toward the stairs. The door at the end of the upstairs hall stood open. Rebecca's expression changed so slightly that Ellie might have missed it if she had not been watching. I didn't know Caleb used that room. Ellie followed her gaze. He doesn't. Rebecca looked back at her. I do. This time Rebecca's eyes went to Caleb. He suddenly found his coffee unusually interesting. Nothing more was said, but something had changed. Ellie realized that Rebecca had known this house well enough to believe there were no rooms in Caleb Redhawk's life she had not seen. Until now. Much later, after Rebecca had gone and the lamps had been turned low, Ellie found Caleb checking the lock on the back door. She leaned against the kitchen entrance. Did she ever stay here? Caleb turned. Rebecca. No. The Queen of England. He studied her for a moment. Why do you care? I don't. Caleb kept looking at her. Ellie should have known better. He had spent too many years being the person who could tell when she was hiding something. One corner of his mouth was, You're lying. By the time Ellie was 14, she and Caleb had mostly stopped trying to make each other miserable. Mostly. He still moved her things when he was bored. She still found ways to make him regret it. And neither of them would have admitted that the arguments had become less about winning and more about having an excuse to keep the other one talking. There was also a rule between them that no one had ever spoken aloud. Caleb was allowed to make Ellie angry. Other people were not. One afternoon outside the general store, a boy a few years older than Ellie watched Vivian climb into the wagon beside Silas and called after her. How many husbands does that make for your ma? Ellie stopped with a sack of flour in her arms. She had heard worse before, and she was already turning with an answer when Caleb spoke from the back of the wagon. You done? The boy glanced at him. Wasn't talking to you. I know. Caleb went back to loading grain. He did not threaten him or even raise his voice. But the boy looked at him for another second and decided he had somewhere else to be. On the ride home, Ellie waited until they were out of town before saying, "I could have handled him." "I know." "Then why did you say anything?" Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "He was annoying me. You weren't even listening until he mentioned me." "Sounds like you imagined that." Ellie kicked his boot hard enough to make his foot slip from the wagon board. Caleb caught himself, glared at her, and she smiled sweetly at the road ahead. Their lives might have continued that way for years if the adults around them had been better at staying. Silas died after a long decline that surprised almost no one. Years of drinking had taken from him slowly, until one morning there was simply nothing left to take. The house grew quieter after his death. Vivian stayed for a while, but Ellie recognized the old restlessness before her mother ever said a word. She had seen it in 2 other houses. Before 2 other departures, Vivian began complaining about the town, asking careful questions about money, looking toward the road, as though somewhere beyond it, a better life had been waiting specifically for her. Even so, Ellie did not expect to come home one afternoon and find her mother's visa gone. Most of the money Silas had left was gone with them. There was a note on the table. Vivian wrote that she had found an opportunity elsewhere, that Ellie was old enough to understand, and that she would send for her once things were settled. Ellie read it once, folded it neatly, and sat down. Caleb found her there near sunset. He took one look at the empty hook where Vivian's coat had hung, then at the folded paper on the table. "She's gone. I think the missing clothes were my first clue." Her voice was calm enough that Caleb did not answer immediately. He removed his hat and set it down. After a moment, Ellie asked, "What happens to me?" His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "She's gone." "I know. I can't stay here." That seemed to confuse him more than anything else she had said. "Says who?" Ellie looked at him. "This was your father's house. So, I'm not his daughter. So, I'm not your sister either." Caleb's jaw shifted. So, something in Ellie finally gave way. Not enough for tears, but enough that her voice no longer sounded quite so steady. "I don't have anyone. You've got me." The answer came so quickly that they both went still. Caleb looked away first, as if he had accidentally said more than he meant to. "And this house," he added roughly. "This is your house too." Ellie stared at him. She had lived in enough places to know that a roof did not make a home, and she had heard enough promises from adults to know better than to trust one simply because she wanted it to be true. Caleb did not promise that he would never leave. He did not tell her everything would be all right. He only pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, and began counting what little money they had left. That night, Ellie did not pack. Caleb never asked her to. The years that followed belonged to the 2 of them. Caleb worked wherever horses or cattle could earn him a wage, while Ellie washed clothes, helped at the general store, studied whenever she could, and eventually earned a little teaching younger children their letters. Their coins went into the same jar, their food onto the same table. A torn sleeve was mended instead of replaced. A worn pair of boots lasted another season because there were other things the money needed to buy first. Some nights there was plenty. Some nights there was only enough. One evening, Caleb pushed the last piece of meat across the table toward Ellie. She cut it in half and pushed one piece back. "Did you eat?" "Yeah." Ellie looked at him. "Liar." Caleb looked at the piece she had returned, then picked it up and ate it. Neither of them said thank you. They had long since stopped keeping track of who owed whom. By the time Ellie was 17, the house Vivian had once brought her to no longer felt borrowed. It was simply home. And then, one evening, Caleb walked out of the stable and saw a young man escorting Ellie to the gate. The young man said something that made her laugh before tipping his hat and leaving. When Ellie came toward the stable, she found Caleb running a cloth over a saddle that was already clean. "Don't like him," he said. Ellie stopped. "You don't know him." "Know enough." She folded her arms and studied him, waiting for more. But Caleb kept his attention fixed on the saddle. For years, Ellie had known exactly why Caleb became angry when someone insulted her, why he noticed when she had not eaten, and why there would always be a place for her at his table. This was different. For the first time, Ellie found herself wondering why Caleb cared who walked her home. By the time Ellie was 17 and Caleb 19, their arguments had changed in a way neither of them seemed willing to examine too closely. Caleb still found reasons to dislike any young man who lingered near her. One talked too much. Another had lazy hands. A third laughed too loudly, which Ellie had not known was a character flaw until Caleb informed her of it. She knew he was jealous. What surprised her was discovering that jealousy could travel both ways. Caleb had grown into the kind of man women noticed. Ellie first became aware of it at the general store, when a rancher's daughter smiled at him for far longer than necessary while asking about a horse she had no intention of buying. Caleb seemed not to notice. Ellie noticed enough for both of them. You could have told her the horse was lame, and she still would have bought it. Caleb glanced at her as they walked home. "Horse isn't lame. That wasn't my point." "I know." His mouth shifted slightly. Ellie hated that smile, mostly because it meant he knew exactly what her point had been. Neither of them spoke about it again. That summer, Caleb began taking every job he could find. He worked horses during the day, repaired fences when there was light left, and sometimes rode miles to help ranchers with stock that needed handling. Ellie complained that he worked too much. Caleb told her she worried too much. One night, he promised he would be home by 9. It was nearly midnight when his horse finally came up the road. Caleb saw the light before he saw the house. One kitchen window glowed against the darkness. He slowed without meaning to. Ellie was sitting at the table when he entered, a book open in front of her. She looked down at the page so quickly that Caleb knew she had been watching the door. "Why are you awake?" "I was reading." "At midnight. Some of us can read for more than 5 minutes without getting tired." Caleb hung his hat near the door. "You were waiting." Ellie turned a page she had clearly already read. "You said you'd be back by 9. Didn't know I had a wife." That made her look up. "You don't." The room became strangely quiet. Caleb had heard Ellie say sharper things 100 times, but this landed differently. Perhaps it was because she was no longer 10 years old, sitting several feet away from him, behind a stable. Perhaps it was because he was no longer 12. He crossed the kitchen to take the book from her. "You're holding it upside down." Ellie looked down. She wasn't. "You're an idiot." "I know." She reached for the book, and Caleb did not let go immediately. Their hands were close on the cover. So were they. For the first time, the distance between them felt like something that could be crossed. Neither moved. Then Caleb released the book. "Go to bed." "Ellie," she did. But long after the lamp went dark, Caleb remained in the kitchen. Years later, they stood in that same room arguing over coffee. "You threw it out," Caleb asked. "It was terrible. It was mine. It could have stripped paint. I liked it." "That says more about you than the coffee." Caleb reached past her for the new tin at the same moment. Ellie tried to take it. Their shoulders met. Neither moved away. Ellie lifted her face Caleb was suddenly aware of how close she was. I had known her face in every age that mattered. He knew the small line that appeared between her brows when she was annoyed, the faint scar near her chin from falling out of a tree at 13, and the exact look she gave him when she knew he was pretending not to care. But he did not remember her mouth being this close. His eyes dropped to it. Ellie saw. She did not step back. For one dangerous moment. Neither did Caleb. Then Jonathan Hale came into his mind. John beside her in town. John carrying her bag. John belonging to the years Caleb knew nothing about. Caleb stepped away. Hale's a good man. Ellie's expression changed so quickly, he almost wished he could take the words back. Almost? What? He's got a steady position. Education. Seems decent enough. I'm delighted you approve. I'm saying you could do worse. Ellie stared at him. Then she set the coffee tin on the table. Then maybe you should marry him. She walked out before Caleb could answer. The next afternoon, John came to the ranch with several books the school had ordered. Ellie met him on the porch. Still irritated enough with Caleb to be grateful for someone who could hold a conversation without turning it into an argument. John handed her the books. It's good seeing you here again. For the school. For yourself. He smiled. After what it cost to get you out of this town the first time, I wasn't sure you'd ever come back. Ellie's hand stopped on the stack. What do you mean? John's smile faded. The money Caleb gave up, so you could go. Ellie stared at him. What are you talking about? John was silent for a moment. Then his face changed. You don't know. John tried to take the words back, almost as soon as he had spoken them. It was years ago. Ellie, I assumed you knew. I didn't. He should be the one to tell you. That alone was enough to make her certain Caleb never would. She did not spend the afternoon hunting through old papers or questioning half the town. She simply went to the livery stable, where Amos Turner still worked 3 days a week, despite insisting for the last 5 years that he was about to retire. Amos had known Caleb when they were both young enough to take whatever work they could get. When Ellie asked about the money, the old man became quiet. So John told you. Not enough. Amos rubbed one hand across his jaw. Caleb won't thank me for this. He rarely thanks anyone for anything. That earned the faintest smile. Amos finally leaned against the stall door. You remember that bay he used to work with? Tall gelding, white mark over the left eye. Ellie did. Caleb had spent nearly a year training the horse for a rancher who could no longer manage him. When the man eventually offered to sell, Caleb had saved every dollar he could. He had talked about breeding horses one day, not simply breaking them for other men. A small operation of his own. Good stock. His own name on the gate. It had been the first future Ellie had ever heard Caleb describe, as if he truly believed he might have one. He bought that horse, Amos said, and a small interest in a breeding outfit south of town. Wasn't much, but it was a start. Ellie remembered that too. Though she had never known the details, she remembered Caleb coming home exhausted and still going outside after supper to work with the bay. She remembered him keeping coins in an old tobacco tin beneath his mattress. She remembered how angry he became when she once joked about stealing it. Then the letter from the Teachers' Academy had arrived. Ellie had been accepted. The tuition was manageable. The journey was not. There were books, lodging, clothes, and months before she could earn enough to support herself. She had nearly refused. A week later, Caleb placed an envelope on the kitchen table. There was enough money inside to make leaving possible. Her younger self had stared at it. Where did you get it? Work. What kind? The kind that pays. She had known he was taking extra jobs. So eventually, she had believed him. What Ellie had not known was that the bay disappeared from the stable the same week. So did Caleb's share in the little horse operation. Amos looked toward her. He told to both. Ellie said nothing for a long moment. By the time she returned to the ranch, the sun was dropping behind the corrals. Caleb was outside repairing a section of fence. He looked up when she approached and seemed to understand from her face that something had changed. Ellie stopped on the other side of the rail. You sold your horse. Caleb went back to tightening the wire. I've sold a lot of horses. Don't. His hand stopped. Ellie waited until he finally looked at her. The bay. And your share in that breeding operation. Caleb set the tool down. It was a horse. Ellie, it was your plan. His gaze moved past her toward the ranch. From where they stood, the main barn was visible beyond the corrals. Several young horses grazed in the far pasture, and another string had come in only the week before. Everything Caleb had once wanted on a much smaller scale now surrounded him. It was one version of it. Ellie looked at him. That doesn't change what you gave up. I didn't give it up. I changed direction. For me. Caleb's expression closed slightly. She stepped closer to the fence. Why? You had somewhere to go. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. There it was again. The same infuriating wall he had been putting between them since she came home. Caleb could give away a horse, a plan, perhaps years of work, but apparently explaining why was asking too much. Ellie looked toward the ranch and understood something that made the anger harder to hold cleanly. For years, she had believed Caleb had eventually grown tired of carrying her. He had told her so himself. He had made her believe that sending her away had been a relief, that she had become one responsibility too many. But before he had pushed her out of his life, he had quietly sold the first future he had ever built for himself to make hers possible. Those two truths did not fit together, unless one of them had never been true. Ellie looked back at him. What else did you lie about? Caleb's face gave her nothing. Then another memory surfaced. The envelope on the kitchen table had covered most of what she needed, but not all of it. More money had come later. Caleb had always dismissed her questions the same way. Work. The kind that pays. Ellie studied him. What kind of work paid for the rest of it? Caleb. For the first time since she had come home, Caleb would not look at her. Caleb did not answer her that evening. He picked up the tool he had set beside the fence and went back to work, as if Ellie had asked a question about the weather. She knew him well enough not to push when he had decided to become a wall. What she did not know was that the answer had begun years earlier, when Caleb was 19 and desperate enough to mistake good money for good luck. By then, people around the county knew he had a way with difficult horse. He could settle an animal other men had made worse by fighting it. And he was willing to ride farther and work later than most. That was how Gideon Voss found him. Voss bought and sold horses across several territories. He dressed well, paid in cash, and never seemed concerned about the price of anything. At first, the work was ordinary. Caleb broke horses' ices, moved small herds between ranches, and occasionally rode out to inspect stock before Voss bought it. More importantly, the money was better than anything Caleb had earned before. After selling his bay and his share in the breeding operation to help Ellie leave for school, Caleb needed that money more than he wanted to admit. There were still expenses he had not accounted for, and he had already decided that Ellie would never know what any of it had cost him. So when Voss offered another job, Caleb took it. Then the work began to change. A group of horses arrived after dark one night, when there was no reason for them to travel after sunset. Caleb noticed that 2 brands had been altered badly enough that the older marks were still visible beneath the fresh burns. Another time, Voss sent him to meet 3 riders miles from the main road. None gave their names, and one turned his face away whenever Caleb looked too long. Caleb stopped asking questions because he already knew the answers. The horses were stolen. The next time, Voss offered him work. Caleb refused. They were standing behind a stockyard when Voss yelled, as though Caleb had made a joke. "You've been paid well for work I did. And now you find somebody else." Voss's smile remained, but nothing warm stayed in it. Men who are done forget what they've seen. Caleb met his eyes. "I forget easy." "I hope so." Voss adjusted one glove before adding, almost casually, "Hope the girl does too." Caleb did not move. That was the only reason Voss smiled again. He had found what he was looking for. Caleb went home that night and said nothing to Ellie. He told himself Voss was bluffing. Men like him looked for weaknesses because sometimes knowing one was enough. Caleb began refusing the work anyway, and avoided the places where Voss's riders gathered. For several days, nothing happened. Then Caleb came out of the general store one afternoon and saw one of Voss's men across the street. The man was not looking at him. Ellie stood farther down the boardwalk, with several books tucked against her chest, talking to the schoolmaster. She laughed at something the older man said. Across the road, Voss's rider watched her. He never approached, never spoke. When Ellie turned toward home, the man simply touched the brim of his hat and walked away. Caleb understood. That evening, Ellie found him unusually quiet at supper. She asked what was wrong. He told her he was tired. A few days later, the final papers arrived from the teacher's academy. There was a place waiting for her, far from the town, far from Gideon Voss, far from Caleb and every bad choice he had made, trying to find enough money to give her that opportunity in the first place. For the first time, Ellie leaving did not look like losing her. It looked like keeping her safe. Years later, standing beside the same ranch fence, Ellie listened as Caleb finally gave her enough of the story to understand what the rest of it meant. "You were moving stolen horses races. I was working for a man who was moving them. By the time I knew what he was doing, I was already useful to him. And when you tried to leave," Caleb's silence answered before he did. "He knew about me." Ellie said, "Yes." The anger she had carried into the conversation changed shape. She remembered being 17 and complaining that Caleb had suddenly begun asking where she was going, when she would be home, who would be there. She had thought he was being unbearable. Perhaps he had been watching the road. "Is that why you sent me away?" Caleb looked toward the pasture. "Part of it." Ellie waited. When he said nothing more, she stepped closer. "What's the other part?" His jaw tightened. "Caleb, leave it alone." "No." He looked at her then. Ellie held his gaze. She had spent years believing the simplest explanation because he had given her no other one. He had grown tired of her. He wanted his own life. She had become something he needed to be free of. Now, every new truth was pulling that story apart. "You weren't afraid of them," she said. Something changed in his face. "You don't know what I was afraid of." "Then tell me." For several seconds, Caleb said nothing. When the answer finally came, it was so quiet, Ellie almost missed it. "Me." Caleb had spent most of his life believing there were some things a man could outrun if he worked hard enough. Poverty was one of them. His father was another. By 19, he had already learned how wrong he could be. He remembered very little about his mother, without also remembering Silas. There had been good days once. Caleb knew that because his mother had laughed sometimes, and because there were mornings when Silas had looked at her as though she were the only person in the room. Whatever love had existed between them had not saved her from the life that followed. That was the part Caleb could never forget yet. A man could love someone and still make her life smaller. He could need her and still hurt her. He could promise himself he would be different and discover too late that promises were easier than becoming a different man. Caleb had spent years despising his father. What frightened him more, as he grew older, was discovering pieces of Silas in himself. The temper he kept on a short leash, the pride that made asking for help feel like humiliation, the instinct to shut people out whenever they came close enough to matter. And no one had ever come closer than Ellie. That summer, Caleb had almost nothing to offer her. The first plan he had made for himself was gone. He was working for a man whose money had turned dangerous, and that danger had already learned Ellie's name. Meanwhile, a letter sat on the kitchen table, offering her something Caleb had never been able to give her. A way out, a profession, a future that did not depend on how much money they could put into a jar at the end of the week. Ellie could leave this town and become a teacher. She could live somewhere no one knew Vivian's name or remembered Silas. She could build a life in which survival was no longer the first question she asked every morning. Or she could stay with him. Caleb knew which one he wanted. That was exactly why he did not trust himself to choose it. Ellie noticed the change almost immediately. He began talking about the academy, as though her departure had already been decided. He asked when she needed to leave, what she would take, whether the school had arranged lodging. Whenever she spoke about staying, Caleb found another practical reason she should go. Finally, one evening, she put down the shirt she was mending and looked across the kitchen table at him. "I can wait a year." Caleb did not look up. "No, you didn't even think about it." "Nothing to think about. I could work here another year. Save more. You wouldn't have to take every job anyone offers you." His hand stopped over the harness buckle he was repairing. "This isn't about me." "Then stop making it sound like I'm being chased out of town. You got accepted. You go." Ellie stared at him. "I'll wait." 2 words. They frightened Caleb more than anything Gideon Voss had said, because he knew Ellie. If he told her about the stolen horses, she would not pack faster. She would ask how much danger he was in. If he told her Voss had used her name to threaten him, she would become angry enough to stay simply because someone had tried to frighten her away. And if Caleb told her the rest, that somewhere along the way, she had become the first person he looked for when he came home, and the last person he wanted to lose, she might stay for him. He could not allow himself to ask that of her, so he made the decision for both of them. Over the following days, Caleb became colder. When Ellie tried to talk about what would happen after she left, he changed the subject. When she asked whether he would visit, he told her the ranch work would keep him busy. When she mentioned coming home during the holidays, he said there was no point planning that far ahead. Each answer put another inch between them. Ellie felt every one. The night before she had to give the academy her final decision, Caleb was alone in his room when the door opened. Ellie stepped inside and closed it behind her. There was no anger on her face this time. That made it worse. "I'm only going to ask you once." Caleb looked at her and knew the question before she spoke it. He also knew that, to make her leave, he would have to lie to the one person who had always known when he did. Ellie stood inside Caleb's room, with one hand still resting on the door she had closed behind her. "I'm only going to ask you it once." Caleb waited. For days, he had prepared himself for this conversation, without knowing exactly when it would come. He had imagined the things he might say, the arguments he could use, all the practical reasons Ellie should take the opportunity she had been given. None of them mattered when she was standing in front of him. "Do you want me to leave?" Caleb had known the question was coming. Yes. Ellie watched him. "You're lying." The words were almost familiar enough to make him smile. She had been saying them to him since she was 10 years old, usually over missing food, money, or whatever trouble he had decided she did not need to know about. This time, Caleb said nothing. Ellie stepped closer. "Tell me what's really going on." "I just did." "No, you didn't. You've been trying to get rid of me for weeks. You got into the academy. You should go." "That isn't what I asked." Caleb looked away. He could still stop. He could tell her about Voss. Tell her about the man across the street who had watched her. Tell her that every cold word of the past few weeks had been chosen because fear had made honesty impossible. But then Ellie might stay. And Caleb knew exactly how to make sure she didn't. He knew the wound because he had watched other people put it there. "I'm tired, Ellie." Her expression changed slightly. Caleb forced himself to continue. "I've been taking care of this place since my father died. Taking whatever work I can get. Figuring out how to keep food on the table and money in the jar. I worked too. I know." "Then what are you saying?" He made himself look at her. "I'm saying maybe it's time we stopped pretending this has to be forever." For the first time, Ellie went completely still. Caleb could have chosen another lie. Instead, he chose the one she would believe. "You came here because your mother married my pa Hewitt. They're both gone now. You've got somewhere else to go. And I've got a life to build." Ellie stared at him. "So that's what I am." He hated how quiet her voice had become. A responsibility. Caleb did not answer quickly enough. That was answer enough. Something closed behind her eyes. He had seen that look once before. On the afternoon, Vivian disappeared. Ellie had sat at the kitchen table pretending the abandonment did not hurt until she finally whispered that she had no one. Caleb had told her she had him. Now he was taking those words back. "I see," she said. He almost broke then. Instead, he stayed where he was. Ellie reached for the door, then stopped. "Look at me." Caleb did. Her eyes were bright, but she would not let herself cry in front of him. "Do you want me gone?" Every part of him wanted to say no. Yes. Ellie held his gaze for another second. This time, she believed him. She left 2 days later. Caleb did not go to the station. Ellie looked for him anyway. She hated herself for doing it. But as her trunk was loaded and the conductor called for passengers, her eyes searched the platform one final time. Caleb was not there. What she never knew was that he stood beyond the freight shed, far enough away that she could not see him. He watched her board. He watched the train begin to move, and he stayed there until the last car disappeared. That evening, Caleb returned to the ranch after dark. As he rode toward the house, habit made him look toward the kitchen window. For years, whenever he had come home late, there had often been a light waiting there. That night, the window was dark. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. For a long time, he sat on his horse and looked at it. The trouble with Gideon Voss did not last forever. Once Ellie was safely away, Caleb stopped worrying about what speaking might cost her. He took what he knew to men he trusted, including ranchers who had already lost horses and a lawman willing to listen when several names told the same story. Others came forward. Brands were traced. Roots were uncovered. And Voss's operation began to collapse. Within months, the immediate danger was over. Caleb stayed. He started again with horses hasties, this time on his own terms. One animal became three. Three became a small string. And work slowly became something more permanent. The years that followed eventually gave him the ranch Ellie would one day return to. But he never wrote and told her she could come home. At first, Caleb told himself she needed time to build a life away from him. Then he heard she was doing well. That became another reason not to interfere. Months became years. By the time he understood that silence could become a choice of its own, he had been choosing it for a long time. In the present, Ellie stood across from him beside the fence as the last of the evening light disappeared from the pasture. The danger ended. Caleb did not try to avoid it. Yes. And you still never wrote? No. Ellie's eyes stayed on his, for the first time since the truth had begun coming apart. There was no confusion left in her face, only hurt. And beneath it, anger she had every right to feel. So don't you dare tell me Voss was the reason I lost all those years. Caleb did not try to defend himself. That only made Ellie angrier. For years, she had imagined what she would say if she ever learned that his reasons for sending her away were not the ones he had given her. In none of those imagined conversations had Caleb simply stood there and accepted her anger as though he had already passed judgment on himself. You could have written, she said. One letter. I know. You knew where I was. Yes. The danger was over. Yes. Then why? Caleb looked toward the pasture before answering. I heard you were doing well. Ellie stared at him. You were studying. You had work. People there respected you. You had a chance to build something that had nothing to do with this place. And I wasn't going to drag you back. A bitter laugh escaped her. Drag me back. You got the life you deserved. Ellie looked at him for a long moment. You still don't understand. Then explain it. You don't get to decide what I deserve. Caleb's expression shifted. Ellie stepped closer. Years of questions finally finding somewhere to go. You decided I should leave. You decided I couldn't know why. Then when the danger was over, you decided I was better without you. Every time there was a choice to make about my life, you made it before I even knew there was a choice. I was trying to keep you safe. At first, yes. And maybe if you had told me then, I would have stayed. Maybe I would have been foolish enough to stay even knowing the danger. But that should have been mine to decide. Caleb had no answer. You took away my right to know the truth. My right to be angry with you. My right to be afraid. You even took away my right to choose you anyway. That landed. She saw it. Caleb looked down for a moment before saying, I didn't have anything to offer you. I never asked what you had. You should have. There. You're doing it again. His eyes came back to hers, deciding what I should have wanted. For once, Caleb had nowhere to hide. Voss had been real. The danger had been real. So had the fear that he might become the kind of man who made Ellie's life smaller. But the years afterward belonged to him. That silence had been his choice. After a moment, he said, Hale could give you more than I could then. Ellie closed her eyes briefly. Of all the things he could have said, John is my friend. He wants more. That doesn't mean I gave it to him. Caleb went still. Ellie stared at him in disbelief. Is that what you thought? I saw you together. You saw him carry a bag. He knew things about your life I didn't. Whose fault was that? Caleb's jaw tightened. Ellie almost laughed, but there was nothing funny left in it. John has been a good friend to me. He never asked me to promise him anything, and I never let him believe I had. Caleb absorbed that in silence. Then Ellie thought of another name, and Rebecca. This time it was Caleb who looked tired. What about her? Don't make me ask twice. He leaned back against the fence. Her husband left debts. Then Winter nearly finished what the debts started. I helped. I know that part. She needed someone. And you. Caleb took longer to answer. There was a time I thought maybe I should try. The words hurt more than Ellie expected. With her. Yes. What happened? His gaze settled on her face. Nothing. Ellie waited. Caleb looked away first. I couldn't. That was all he gave her. It was enough. The anger inside Ellie did not disappear. Neither did the years between them. But suddenly, John was no longer standing between them. Neither was Rebecca. Neither was Gideon Voss. For the first time, there was nothing left between Ellie and Caleb except the choices they themselves had made. Caleb finally asked, "Then what do you want from me?" Ellie looked at the man who had once given up his first dream for her, then broken her heart because he had convinced himself that loving her meant deciding when she should leave. For once, she stepped away from the fence. Nothing. She went inside and upstairs without looking back. Caleb remained outside, long after the light disappeared from her bedroom window. He thought he had finally managed to lose her without a lie between them. The next morning, he came downstairs and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Ellie was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a stack of school papers beside her. She looked up. "Morning." Caleb stared at her. "You're still here." Caleb remained in the kitchen doorway, long enough for Ellie to take another sip of coffee. "You're still here. So you said? I thought you wanted nothing from me." "I don't." His brow furrowed. Ellie returned to the school paper in front of her. "Those two things aren't the same." Caleb stood there, as though she had presented him with a problem involving mathematics he deeply resented. Ellie almost smiled. She had spent years wondering why he had sent her away. Now she knew. She also knew something Caleb apparently had not learned in all that time. Understanding why someone hurt you did not erase the hurt. And loving someone did not require saving him from the consequences of his choices. So Ellie stopped trying to make Caleb understand himself. She simply went on with her life. At the ranch. This proved surprisingly difficult for him. "The train leaves Friday," he said 2 days later. Ellie continued buttering her bread. "I'm aware." On Friday morning, Caleb came in from the barn and found her at the kitchen table. Her boots were still beside his. At the door, her books were still on the table. Her coffee was still too strong. He looked at the clock, then at her. "You missed your train." "No. The morning train left 20 minutes ago." "I know." "Then why are you here?" Ellie turned a page. "Didn't get on." Caleb stared at her. "Why?" She looked up. "Do you need something?" "Yes." An answer. "I thought you were fond of not giving those." Caleb walked out before he said something he would regret. Ellie waited until the door closed before smiling. John came to the ranch that afternoon with papers for the school. Caleb was near the corral. And for once, John stopped to speak with him before going to the house. "You know she didn't take the train." "I noticed." John smiled faintly. "I imagine you did." Caleb rested his arms on the fence. After a moment, John said, "I care about her." Caleb's face changed very little. "I know. She could build a good life with me." Caleb looked toward the horses. Probably. There was no challenge in his voice, which seemed to surprise John more than anger would have. "But she won't," John said. Caleb looked at him. John was quiet for a moment. "Ellie has never promised me anything. She never asked what I felt for her to make herself less lonely." I stayed because I wanted to. Caleb said nothing. John glanced toward the house. When she thinks about where she belongs, she doesn't look at me. He left Caleb with that and carried the papers inside. Rebecca came 2 days later. She did not stay for coffee. Whatever hope she had allowed herself over the years had become difficult to maintain now that Ellie's books were on the table. Her boots were at the door, and Caleb's attention found her even when he was trying not to look. Rebecca stood on the porch before leaving and asked quietly, "Was there ever a chance?" Caleb could have made the answer easier. He did not. "I thought maybe." Rebecca nodded once, until she came back. Caleb's silence answered. Pain crossed her face, but not surprise. "I think I knew before you did." She gave him a small, tired smile and left. After that, the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt dangerously familiar. Ellie went to the schoolhouse each morning. Caleb worked the ranch. Sometimes she returned first. And when Caleb rode home after dark, a lamp would be burning in the kitchen window. Neither mentioned it. She asked whether he had eaten. He lied often enough that she still had reason to tell him so. He complained about her coffee while drinking it every morning. She moved his things. He moved them back. Nothing had been forgiven completely. Nothing had been promised. But each day Ellie stayed. The house seemed to remember her a little more. Caleb never asked her to. That was the one word he still could not give himself permission to say. Then one afternoon, he returned earlier than expected. He opened the back door and stopped. Ellie's boots were gone. Caleb looked toward the dining table. Her books were gone too. He was upstairs before he had fully decided to move. The door at the end of the hall stood open. Ellie was inside. Her traveling case lay on the bed, half packed. For a moment, Caleb simply looked at it. Years earlier, he had watched her leave because he had convinced himself it was the best thing he could do for her. Now every instinct in him wanted to cross the room, close the case, and tell her she was not going anywhere. He did none of those things. Ellie looked up. Caleb kept his face still. "When are you leaving?" "Tomorrow morning." Ellie's answer came quietly. Caleb stood in the doorway of her room, looking at the traveling case on the bed. "The school found someone." "They did." He nodded. There it was. The practical reason she had returned was over. Whatever had kept her here after that was apparently over too. Caleb went downstairs before she could see how badly he had misunderstood his own ability to let her leave. Ellie came downstairs the next morning carrying her traveling case. Caleb was already in the kitchen. He stood beside the table with a cup of coffee in front of him, though it had gone cold long before Ellie reached the bottom step. He had heard her moving upstairs for nearly an hour. A drawer opening, footsteps crossing the room, the faint closing of the case. He had known what every sound meant. Still, seeing the luggage in her hand was different. Ellie stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Caleb looked at her. Neither spoke. There was no Gideon Voss this time. No danger waiting beyond the ranch. No academy offering Ellie the only future she might ever have. She was a grown woman with work, friends, and a life she had built for herself. If she wanted to leave, Caleb had no right to stop her. Perhaps this was the part he had always been supposed to learn. Loving someone did not mean deciding for them. It meant letting them choose, even when the choice took them away from you. So Caleb said nothing. Ellie waited. When he still did not speak, she set the case down, reached into her pocket, and took out the house key. She placed it on the table. The small click of metal against wood seemed to fill the kitchen. So that's it. Caleb looked at the key. What do you want me to say? The truth would be new. His eyes lifted to hers. Ellie stepped closer. There's no Voss anymore. I know. John isn't waiting somewhere for me. Caleb's jaw shifted. He's my friend. That's all he has ever been. I know that now. And Rebecca. Caleb said nothing. She isn't the reason either. No. The money is gone. The horse was years ago. I have a profession. I have my own money. I don't need you to give up another future so I can have mine. Caleb looked away. Ellie did not let him stay there. And you are not your father. His expression hardened. You can't know that. I do. You don't know what a man becomes 10 years from now. No. But neither do you. That silenced him. Ellie moved closer until only the table corner separated them. You spent half your life terrified that loving someone might turn you into the man who hurt your mother. So you decided the safest thing you could do was never want too much. Caleb's eyes returned to her. And every time you did want something, you found a reason you shouldn't have it. That's not what happened, isn't it? He did not answer. Ellie took a breath. I can leave. I know. I have somewhere to go. I know. I can take care of myself. I know. Then stop deciding what my life is supposed to look like. Caleb's hand tightened against the edge of the table. Ellie saw it. So don't tell me what's best for me. Don't tell me about John, or Rebecca, or money, or danger. Don't tell me what kind of future I deserve, and don't tell me you're protecting me from a man you're afraid you might become. She held his gaze. Tell me what you want. Caleb said nothing. For most of his life, wanting had been a dangerous thing. He had wanted his mother to stay. He had wanted his father to become someone else. He had wanted a ranch before he could afford one. He had wanted Ellie Whitmore when keeping her safe meant losing her. Somewhere along the way, he had learned to turn love into usefulness. Feed her. Give her a home. Earn the money. Send her to school. Keep danger away. Let her go. Anything except ask her to stay. Ellie waited. When Caleb still could not say it, something in her expression changed. She reached for her case. Then tell me to go. His eyes snapped toward her. Ellie, tell me. Don't do this. Say it like you did before. He went still. Ellie's fingers closed around the handle. Do you want me to leave? For an instant, Caleb saw another room. Ellie at 17, standing in front of him, with hurt in her eyes, asking the same question. He remembered the answer he had forced himself to give. Yes. The one lie she had believed. Now Ellie waited again. Caleb looked at the case in her hand, then at the key lying between them, and finally at her. No. Ellie did not move. Caleb swallowed. No. The second one came rougher. He crossed the small distance between them. For years, he had believed loving Ellie meant knowing when to let her go. For once, he allowed himself to want something instead. Stay. Silence filled the kitchen. Ellie looked at him for so long that Caleb seemed to forget how to breathe. Then she lowered the case to the floor. She reached across the table, picked up the key, and slipped it back into her pocket. I was going to. For a second, Caleb simply stared at her. Then something broke across his face that Ellie had almost forgotten existed. A laugh, small and disbelieving, caught somewhere dangerously close to something else. You packed. I needed you to say it. You were going to stay. I've missed 2 trains already. Caleb, keep up. He laughed again. And this time Ellie smiled, but neither of them stepped away. Years of anger had disappeared from the room, leaving something older underneath it. Ellie looked at him. When? Caleb frowned. When what? You know. I don't. When did you start loving me? Whatever amusement had been in his face vanished. Caleb looked genuinely uncertain. Ellie waited. His mind went backward through years of memories. Ellie asleep over school books at the kitchen table. Ellie splitting the last piece of meat and pushing half toward him. Ellie at 17 beneath a lamp, waiting because he had promised to be home by 9. Then farther, a stable wall, an empty cloth beside him, a 10-year-old girl who had offered him food, been told to leave, and actually left, only to return with water. Maybe the first time you came back. Ellie's eyes softened. I came back a lot. Yeah. Caleb reached for her face, then stopped just short of touching her. For all the decisions he had made for her, he would not make this one. Ellie closed the distance herself. The kiss was not careful. It carried too many years for that. Too many dark kitchen windows, unfinished arguments, missed trains, swallowed words, and all the times one of them had mistaken leaving for the only choice. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. Ellie's hand was still curled into the front of his shirt. Behind them, her traveling case remained on the floor. The key was back in her pocket, and for the first time in their lives, neither of them was waiting for the other one to leave. Some months later, Caleb rode home after dark. The day had run longer than expected, and by the time the ranch came into view, the fields had disappeared into shadow. His horse followed the familiar road toward the house, while Caleb loosened tired fingers around the reins. Then, out of habit, he looked up. A light was burning in the kitchen window. For years, he had trained himself not to look for it. Now, he always did. Caleb dismounted and stepped onto the porch. Beside the door stood 2 pairs of boots. His were where he had left them that morning. Ellie's were beside them, slightly crooked because she still refused to put anything exactly where he thought it belonged. He opened the door. Did you eat? Ellie called from the kitchen. Caleb pulled off his gloves. Once, he would have answered without thinking. Yeah, whether it was true or not. He looked toward the warm light spilling from the kitchen. Not yet. Then wash your hands. Caleb hung his hat by the door. Bossy. Ellie appeared in the kitchen entrance. Still awful. Caleb smiled. Then he went to her.